So welcome. This talk is sponsored by the Yale Center for Environmental Communication at the Yale School of the Environment. And we are focused on four areas. First, we conduct research on the psychological, cultural, and political factors that influence environmental attitudes and behavior. Second, we teach students and train working professionals. Third, we convene a global network of climate communication scholars and practitioners. And finally, we inform and engage the public through environmental journalism, including Yale Climate Connections, which is a climate-focused news service that engages many thousands of people every day and includes a short daily radio story that airs on more than 750 radio stations nationwide. While only 16% of US adults think they themselves will be harmed a great deal by global warming, 55%, a majority, think that future generations will be harmed a great deal. We also find that 3/4 of US adults say that schools should teach our children about the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to global warming. What are young people thinking about climate change and how should this inform how we engage them? That's what we're looking at today. We've been partnering with nonprofits, museums, aquariums, and others working with youth on climate. If you are an organization looking for support in your communications, please reach out to our partnerships team at ypcc.partners@yale.edu. And don't worry if you didn't get that email address, we'll send it to you in the follow-up email to everyone who registered. As for logistics, the chat is closed. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and be aware that you only see the questions you asked. But we have folks monitoring the questions, so be assured your question will be seen. We will be making a recording of this conversation available on our website, and we'll send a link to everyone who registered in the follow-up email. Today's talk will be moderated by Grace Gibson-Snyder. Grace is a sophomore here at Yale, studying global affairs, and is also a plaintiff in the landmark constitutional climate lawsuit you may have seen in the news last summer, Held versus the state of Montana. Grace?
Thank you, Eric, and welcome everyone. We're honored to have three speakers with us today. So Puji Masireddy is a Youth Advisory Board member at Action for the Climate Emergency, or ACE, and a second-year student at Wesleyan University, majoring in economics and minoring in data analysis and environmental studies. Dr. Matthew Ballew is a research specialist at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. His research focuses on the factors that shape people's responses to environmental issues and how communicators can leverage this knowledge to more effectively connect with their audiences and support opinion and behavior change. Finally, Stephanie Haynes is the environment and climate writer at the Christian Science Monitor, where she worked on the Climate Generation Project, interviewing young people around the world to cover how they're shaping what it means to live in a world altered by a changing climate. So we're going to start it off today with Dr. Matthew Ballew.
Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to share our results on American adults in the US and what they think about climate change. So thank you for the introduction. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, we conduct nationally representative surveys of American adults twice a year. And so we do this in the fall and the spring. And so this is what we call the Climate Change in the American Mind Project. And in these surveys, we ask Americans about their opinions and behaviors related to climate change. And so in our research, we have found what other researchers have called an age or generation gap in climate views. And so this has been found not just in the US, but also other countries as well. So let's take a look at what this means. And so just a heads up, I'm going to be presenting a lot of data. So sit tight and enjoy the ride. You will have these slides available to you after the presentation today. So You may have heard of Global Warming 6 Americas, and we developed this framework to understand how Americans think and feel about climate change. And so it represents a spectrum of people's opinions about climate change, and there are 6 groups in total. So all the way at the left, we have the alarmed, and they have the strongest pro-climate views. They are most worried about climate change. They're most motivated to act. And all the way on the right here, we have the dismissive, and they are more likely to reject the reality of climate change. They're least worried about it, and they're least motivated to act. So what does this breakdown look across age or generation groups, if you will? So we published this last year, and we found that Gen Z and millennials are more likely than older generations to be alarmed or concerned about global warming. They're also less likely to be doubtful or dismissive. And we found that in particular, it's women of color who tend to be the most alarmed among younger Americans. You can also see all the way on the right here that younger women of color are among the groups who are least likely to be doubtful or dismissive about climate change as well. So let's look at some more specific beliefs about climate change across age groups. So this is data from our Climate Change in the American Mind Explorer, and we actually just updated this tool today to include 2023 data. So this is data from 2022, but you can now explore it, and I definitely encourage you to do so to see the updated data set. And so we find in this research that young adults, they're more likely to understand that global warming is happening, more likely to understand that global warming is human caused. They're also more likely to perceive global warming as a serious threat. For instance, they're more likely to say that it will harm future generations, that it's already harming the US right now, or will do so within the next 10 years. So pay attention to these blue dots here, right? That's the young adults in the US. Also, compared to 2012, we're finding that younger Americans are reporting stronger pro-climate views over the last decade or so. So for instance, you can see that understanding that global warming is happening has increased among younger adults. Belief that it's harming the US or will do so in the next 10 years has increased as well over the last decade or so. Worry about global warming has increased among younger adults over the last decade or so. This personal risk perception that global warming is going to harm me personally has increased. We also find that support for climate policies has increased, right? For instance, funding research in renewable energy, regulating CO2 as a pollutant. So they're becoming more supportive of pro-climate policies. We also find that younger Americans are more likely to talk about global warming in family and friends over the last decade or so. So in 2012, 19% say they do this, at least occasionally. And in 2022, we find 34%. So that has nearly doubled over the last decade or so. Also, this is research from Pew Research Center. And so this is a poll they did last year. And they found that young adults in the US are more likely to talk about the need for action on climate change as well. Not just talking about global warming, but also the need for action. They also found in this survey that younger Americans are more likely to say they engage in climate activism, including donating money to an organization, volunteering, contacting elected officials, or attending a protest or rally. And so this is the percent of adults who say that they've engaged in at least one of those climate actions. And younger adults are more likely to say so. We've also found in research we did a few years ago in 2020 that younger generations are more willing to engage in climate activism. So you can see, paying attention to those green dots, right across all these different actions that people could take, younger generations are more likely to say they would engage in these actions, such as signing a petition, voting for a candidate that supports global warming, and so on. Also, recently, last year, we published a short report on looking at climate change psychological distress across various groups in the US. And we found that Gen Z and millennials were among the groups who are most likely to report higher levels of climate change psychological distress. such as feeling nervous or anxious on edge because of global warming, or feeling depressed or hopeless because of global warming. Also, recently, we just published this short note about our data on what Americans want to ask a global warming expert about global warming. And we found, very similar to just all adults in the US as a whole, that people most likely, Gen Z millennials specifically, most likely want to ask a global warming expert about solutions. And so nearly half say they want to know about solutions, compared to, information about the impacts of global warming, or the causes, or evidence that it's happening. And so this is pretty common among people who are more worried about climate change. They're more interested in learning more about the solutions because they already have a stronger understanding of climate change causes, evidence, and impacts. They want to know more about solutions. For instance, is there still time to address it? What can we do? What can institutions do? What can I do? And so from all this research, right, we know that younger Americans on average, they're more pro-climate and they're more engaged with climate change compared to older Americans. We also found that, these views and engagement have increased over time. So why is that? How can we better support youth and young adults? Not just in the US, but also globally elsewhere. And others will speak to that today. So I'm just focused on the US right now. And so these are some perspectives on why younger Americans may be more pro-climate, more engaged. And so, I really love this book that I read last year by Jane Goodall on the Book of Hope. And she talks a lot about how younger folks on average are just more energetic, enthusiastic to create change, to go out in the world and to do something to impact people. So it's just like this general tendency that younger people tend to have compared to older people. And also, from an intergenerational justice perspective, we know younger folks are more likely to bear the burden of climate change and the harms. They're more exposed, more vulnerable to climate impacts over time. And so as a result, right, they may be more dissatisfied with actions taken to reduce global warming. There's not enough action. We need to do more action because we're more likely to be exposed to these harms. Also, perspectives out there say that, younger generations, we also know this too when we're in high school, right, or middle school, that we're really attentive to what other people are doing. And so younger people may be more, attuned to what their peers are doing or what other people in their age group are doing, for instance, online. And so research has found that a key predictor of action in youth is the perceived climate activism of friends. Are my friends engaging in climate activism? And if they are, I may be more likely to get involved as well. And also identifying with climate activists is a key predictor. And these group-based emotions of feeling like you are experiencing injustices, that you're angry about the fact that climate change is happening and you are more likely to be exposed to the harms. These feelings, these emotions, these group-based emotions in particular are predictors of activism as well. And it's not just feelings of rage and injustice, but also over time, research has found that younger adults are feeling just more negative emotions on average about climate change. So there's these emotional drivers here that may be bouncing off, younger adults, where they're communicating with each other about their emotions. And this may be partially because they're more exposed to information online through social media. Also just education in general, they're more likely to be exposed to climate science. And so we all know that there's a lot of young climate activists out there. They're not shy to demand solutions and to voice their opinions, which is great. We need this, right? So they'd be more likely to see this kind of information. It's like, hey, people in my age group care about this issue. We also know from research that there are political and demographic shifts among younger generations. And so we have found in our research, Pew has also found this too, that there's some indication that younger adults are less politically polarized on climate change compared to older adults. And also Pew has found that the youngest generation is on track to be the most diverse and most educated generation yet. So these are just some reasons as to why they may be more pro-climate engaged. So bottom line, right, we need to figure out ways that we can support them. And so I hope this is something we can talk a little bit more in the rest of our presentations and our discussion. But I also have links for resources available to you as well. Thank you. I'll send it off to the next person.
Thank you, Matthew. As a data nerd, I really enjoyed seeing the numbers laid out like that. And so, hi everyone, my name is, if my screen will load, my name is Puji Masireddy, and I will be discussing the intersection of youth and climate and my experiences working at Action for the Climate Emergency. So I'm currently a youth advisory board member at ACE, and I have been since 2021. And I'm also a board member at ACE's affiliate organization, Climate Emergency Advocates, otherwise known as CIA. And so a little bit more about me. I'm currently a rising junior at Wesleyan, majoring in econ and minoring in data analysis and environmental studies. And I'm from Southeastern Pennsylvania. I first got started in the climate space in 2019 when I joined the ACE Pennsylvania Fellowship. And we did a lot of voter registration work at the time for BIPOC communities. And alongside my work with ACE, I was also involved in grassroots organizing in Chester, Pennsylvania. And if you're unfamiliar, Chester is a predominantly low-income Black community and is home to one of the country's largest toxic waste incinerators. And as you can imagine, this incinerator was responsible for contributing to rampant air pollution and negative health outcomes and environmental racism. So I worked with organizers to work to resist and campaign against this incinerator, which really launched my passion for the intersection of climate change and public health. And in 2021, like I mentioned, I joined the Youth Advisory Board at ACE. And the Youth Advisory Board's main goal is to center the youth voice at ACE and support the various departments within ACE to amplify the youth voice. I would say that ACE has really opened many doors for me, from being part of an amazing community of youth organizers to global opportunities like attending COP28 this past November. I've really seen how young people have so much power in this movement. And my experiences with grassroots organizing and working at ACE has really launched my interest for the area of public health, as well as climate investment / climate finance. And so a little bit more about ACE. ACE was founded in 2008 and works at the nexus of young people, strategic communications and media, policy advocacy, and civic engagement. At ACE, the mission is to educate, inspire, and support young people to lead the fight for their future. Together, we envision a world in which there is a global movement which is rich in youth leadership, and ACE uses a powerful combination of community-based youth organizing, which I'm excited to talk about, and civic engagement in key states across the US, along with national and global strategic communications through influencer marketing, paid ad campaigns, and a lot of social media digital work. We're guided by the understanding that the communities most impacted by racial injustice and social inequity are also the ones who disproportionately bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change, as we all know. We focus on uplifting these voices, experiences, and solutions. And we believe in telling the whole truth because young people have the right to understand the science of the climate emergency and the impacts of the crisis on our individual lives and, of course, our collective well-being. And so ACE's three main pillars are advancing clean energy, stopping fossil fuel infrastructure, and mobilizing youth voters. We believe in the creativity and power of young people to lead the way in imagining a brighter future, a future that's safe from climate chaos, free from environmental injustice, rich in biodiversity, and prosperous for all. I think the main sentiment that I'm getting at is that young people will continue to play a role across these facets, and they have the direct transformative impact on their friends and communities, and have the power to really solve or attempt to propose solutions for the climate crisis. And climate education is a major part of ACE, and we inoculate young people against disinformation, teach students about the climate emergency, and provide opportunities to take action through the award-winning Our Climate, Our Future digital education resources, which is a tailored curriculum as well as a longer 40-minute educational video, and live in-person assemblies directly in high schools, as well as youth-centered storytelling and digital education that reaches millions of people annually. ACE's theory of change is grounded in foundational climate education for young people. That's really how ACE got its start. We see education as the first organizing opportunity and building block to transform knowledge into action. And it's really important, of course, to build a base of informed activists prepared to take civic and climate action at scale. And so a little bit about our numbers. So we invite young people to take action by joining our Youth Action Network. ACE has over 1 million youth advocates in its action network in all 50 states, and 40% live in rural zip codes. They are engaged in weekly action opportunities, from calling elected officials to phone banking to registering and turning out to vote. Young people speak with the moral authority of a generation that will inherit the worst of the climate emergency. And of course, we are the future leaders, politicians, change makers, advocates, all of the above, that are demanding accountability and action to ensure that we not only survive this climate emergency, but thrive for years to come. And moving on to more of the digital side of ACE, so much of what ACE does is digital content and engaging with young people through social media. We reach tens of millions of people annually through our sophisticated digital media strategies to reach and engage people both inside and outside the climate movement echo chamber, as it was just mentioned, or the Six America continuum, from alarm to the disengaged audiences that are often left behind. I think what's really unique to ACE is that they engage people both inside and outside the climate movement echo chamber, and really attempt to bring the disengaged folks into the circle to inspire action. And we do that through digital strategies. I think what I really enjoy about the digital content is that it's relatable and relevant, especially to young people. If you've ever seen ACE's TikToks, you'll definitely know what I mean by that. And of course, at the top of our engagement are the ACE action teams, which consists of high school students across the country organizing in their communities and demanding action. These action teams have engaged in so many initiatives, from hosting public education events to organizing marches at state capitals to hold big oil accountable. I remember meeting with my elected officials when I was an action team leader, speaking at press events, testifying in support of clean energy projects, and so much more. I think there is so much power in grassroots organizing and local organizing work, and this specific method of distributed organizing really allows for youth leaders to have that opportunity to really make a change in their community. And during my time in the fellowship, which has now transitioned into the action teams, we focused on voter registration campaigns, which is another major pillar of ACE's work. And so in 2024, ACE plans to launch their largest nonpartisan youth voter engagement program to date, with the goals of reaching more than 50 million voters under 35 online, in schools, and out in the streets. Another goal is to register over 100,000 voters and to deploy more than 300 canvassers in high school and college campuses and marginalized communities to get out the youth vote. ACE's platform is primarily youth of color in more rural communities, female, low-income, and other marginalized identities that are often suppressed or overlooked by mainstream campaigns. We focus on reaching, engaging, and supporting them to get to the polls so that their voice can be heard and counted. And now switching gears, looking a little bit more on the global level, ACE is amplifying youth voices by connecting with international youth, scaling our climate education resources, which are now available in Hindi, Kannada, and Portuguese, and bringing our digital media work internationally to inoculate against disinformation. I think the main goal is to tailor this education and digital media to countries like India and Brazil, where millions of people are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And I think what ACE does really well is builds relationships and connects movement leaders in the US to leaders globally by using spaces like COP and Climate Week US to really elevate global voices and to build those relationships. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much. That was great. And it's been wonderful to meet Puji and Grace. And I think those voices really play into what we found during our reporting project at the Christian Science Monitor. And I'm going to try to share my screen here and tell you a little bit about what we've done at the Monitor. And my name, again, is Stephanie Haynes, and I am the climate and environmental writer at the Monitor. For those of you who might not know of our publication, we are an award-winning newsroom. We were created more than 100 years ago to be an example of journalistic excellence around the world. And we tend to focus on stories that show some sort of hope or progress or resilience or some of these shared human values. But at the same time, we approach challenges clear-sightedly. And I think those values influenced how we approached the series that I'm going to tell you about, which was our climate generation work. About a year ago, a colleague of mine named Sarah Yana came to me with this idea. And she was interested in updating a series that we had done in the 1980s, which was called Children in Darkness. That series at the time, reporters had gone around the world looking at the challenges facing young people at the time. These were big human rights issues such as child slavery and child prostitution. We started talking and wanted to try to figure out how to update this. What were the big global problems facing kids today? And really quickly, we came up with climate change. Except we were interested in an important paradox. Since that series on Children in Darkness, the situation for children around the world had really improved. I mean, clearly there are problems and clearly there are exceptions, but overall, young people have gained more rights and have had standards of living increase. And they'd also grown up in this era where rights were expected. And so we were interested, what is this generation? We called them the climate generation, people born since 1989. What are they doing with those newfound rights, that new sense of agency in the face of what's also an unprecedented climate environmental challenge? And we wanted to go around the world and try to talk to different people and to get a sense of what that paradox meant. And so we traveled. Sarah and I and photographers Alfreda Sosa and Melanie Freeman, we went to the Arctic. We went to Barbados. We went to Bangladesh, Namibia. I went to Montana and chatted with Grace. We went to Portugal. And we had a lot of takeaways that are sort of a step back, broad look at these questions that we're talking about now. And the main thing that we realized was that climate change at the Industrial Revolution was this transition that transformed production, but also changed everything about the way we think of life, our families, what we wear, what we eat, how we expect our lives to go. Climate is today's huge cultural mindset transition. And young people are at the center of it because they're the ones who are going to live through it. And this can end up being a lot of different things. And one of the big things that we found is climate resilience through this mindset isn't just activism, although that's certainly an important thread. The climate generation is connected in a way that's just completely different than generations past. We realize that climate resilience can take the form of innovation. Here in Barbados, we found people who were developing biofuel initiatives using sargassum seaweed. We found young people who weren't even talking about climate change, but who were very involved in getting into the green economy and wanted to go and research clean energy and get into that field. We saw here in Portugal people who were returning to the land to farm in a climate resilient way. And climate change was a very important aspect of their decisions, but it wasn't the only one. People here were reimagining what it meant to live a good life, and the realities of a changing ecosystem were a big part of that. We tried to figure out where to go for this series because we could have gone anywhere in the world. Climate is an everything issue, it's an everywhere issue, so we could have gone anywhere. We did know we wanted to go to the Arctic because of the rate of warming there and the impact on communities. But it ended up that this was it was that story, but it was also a different story. What we found there was an example of how young people are really breaking down silos, both between different topical areas, but also this idea of nature and people. Young people are much more ready and willing to look at and conceptualize their lives as being part of one big ecosystem. In the Arctic, we interviewed and followed people who were part of a Guardian program where younger people were learning from indigenous elders, both traditional hunting techniques and also ice knowledge techniques. But they were then using that information to develop new data sets and new technological resources for researchers who were trying to investigate what warming was doing to that ecosystem. I think that was a good example of how sometimes when we talk about climate change, it can be a little bit nebulous. Climate change means everything again. And so those people we interviewed in the Arctic, they weren't necessarily thinking about their work as connected to climate change, but it was very much in line with this big transition that we're talking about. In Bangladesh, there's no doubt that climate change is happening. All those good data points that Matthew was showing us, people aren't wondering about whether climate change exists. So, it's a very low-lying area, and there's increased flooding there and lots of climate migration. And what we realized is that if we're talking about climate change and reporting about climate change, we could be talking about food or politics or gender rights. My colleague Sarah visited a city where both government and civil society leaders were trying to create a new migrant-friendly community. And that was because, again, climate was impacting and accelerating all of these other issues that you hear about. Climate solutions can come in forms like this, where there is rainwater harvesting because of saltwater inundation. It can come in groups of young girls who are parts of climate clubs. And in those clubs, they learn not just about climate change, but about the connections between climate change and other social issues like child marriage. We also realized that, as we saw in Bangladesh, we saw elsewhere, which is that there's also a shift that's happening in this climate change generation of where power lies. And the global South that is seeing these immediate impacts of climate change is taking a greater leadership role in shaping and discovering solutions. And we saw this going to Namibia and interviewing climate activists there. When we first proposed the series, one of the pushbacks that we got from our editors was, okay, this sounds interesting, but how do we know this isn't a story just about white, privileged, Greta Thunberg style activists? And the point that we made and that we found and that we're seeing increasingly around the world is that that is not what the climate activist space looks like. As you heard from Puji, this is an incredibly diverse and inclusive group. And those people who are at the most vulnerable points are also coming up with the biggest solutions. We are seeing, again, a big lifestyle change. This was the big one, maybe the biggest takeaway from our work, which was that young people across the world in all of these different countries, different backgrounds are starting to reevaluate the concept of progress. And we saw the impact of a changing climate as a really big part of that. People are looking for a more sustainable, less consumptive life. People are talking about whether growth, never-ending growth, is really progress. And people are looking to create, in all different ways, something that's more sustainable. So that's a very broad brush version of what we found, but I want to leave it there because I think it influences a lot of the conversations we'll have about activism and about climate action, is that is a hugely, in some ways, looking at it, it can be a hugely broad question. And there are a lot of different avenues for how to see what climate transition can be. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for all of those great presentations. I'm really excited to hear all your thoughts to the questions that we have coming up here. Before we get there, I'd like to add one thought of my own regarding the role of youth in climate work, as a youth in climate work myself. We've seen how much change youth can bring, particularly as the youth climate movement has accelerated over the past decade or so. We've seen youth in massive marches, in lawsuits at the UN, and as someone who has participated, I'm so proud of all that we have accomplished and all the progress that we are beginning to see. But I also feel some resistance to this idea that youth should be involved in or leading this climate work, because we are capable, yes, but particularly youth who are underage, and even those of us who are no longer underage, have limited power. We have limited political influence. We have limited, financial resources. And because of this, and also because climate is a problem that should have been solved decades ago, I feel that youth activism should not be held up as the solution to climate change. One underlying message in the work that I've done and that I see in youth involvement is asking adults to take responsibility for this problem. We ask people in power to do what is necessary so that we as youth, and even more so that future young people, future generations, don't have to take on this challenge. So I want to recognize that, while we absolutely must encourage youth voices and support those that do get involved, we must not forget to hold those with more power responsible for this project as well. So I just wanted to throw in my 2 cents there. But with that said, I'm super excited to kick off our panel discussion. The first question I have for you is kind of related to what I just said, actually. So given this dynamic of youth power and activism and the way that interacts with adults, I'm curious on all of your thoughts on how adults can balance supporting youth and encouraging youth involvement with other forms of climate work, other direct involvement. And I'll add to that another question, if you can pick or do both, is in terms of messaging and encouraging youth involvement, is hope resonating with youth? Is hope an honest message to be imparting? Or is urgency and adults saying, we know this is a serious problem, received better? What do youth want to hear? So that was quite a compound question, but I'll let whoever's interested go for it.
I mean, I can jump in with some of it, and I know that the others will have good thoughts. I mean, I think that the grown-ups in the room really do need to be making changes, and I think that can happen. I think the way to look at that is expansive. There are certainly political and legal changes that young people are demanding, but there are other things. For instance, in Barbados, one of the reasons I went there was because of global finance questions. And can grown-ups, can adults reshape global financial streams to unlock capital for youth who are younger people who are creating climate innovation products? In Portugal, can we readjust farming regulations so people who are engaged in regenerative agriculture, which is the big attraction for younger people, can they access farm credits? So I think that there are real important roles for people who are in power and have decision-making authority. And I think that people should really start to look broadly at that because of what an everything issue climate is.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Stephanie, on especially about the part about innovation and how that is really key to formulating some of these solutions. In terms of the messaging about like, is hope better or is the sense of urgency better? I think it definitely takes a combination of both. And I think in my experience or what I've seen, I think urgency slash this is a serious matter is kind of what catalyzes action, and then hope kind of sustains that action and makes it have some longevity to it. I think you need that urgency to really get the ball rolling, but how do you sustain that? I think if you continue to push urgency and this like seriousness, I think that's what results in like climate anxiety. But rather, if you kind of shift the gears to hope and that focusing on the accomplishments that have been made, and looking at the amazing innovations and new technologies that have been developed, I think that's really what sustains action.
Yeah, Puji, I thought you summed that up perfectly. We know from research that, negative emotions can drive action, but also positive emotions are important to sustaining those actions as well. And having that mix in messages is important as well, right? We know it's a threat. Climate change is harming us. It's going to harm certain groups more. And we want to raise people's concern and worry about the issue. And we know from research that communicating the urgency of climate change and we need to take immediate action now is really important. But that solution, right, that call to action saying that like we need to do something about this right now and that we can do something about it right now is really important in order to reinforce, right, that engagement that we need to get these solutions done and we can get them done. So it's having a mix of both emotions, because as we know, climate change gives us many different emotions, and it's important to validate and recognize that. And then especially among younger adults who may experience more psychological distress about it, how can we get them more engaged in ways that can help them cope with those emotions?
Yeah, I think that was very well said by everyone. I agree, Puji, with your line of hope is the sustaining factor. I think that was beautiful. We're gonna completely shift gears. We can return to this if we'd like later. My second question for you all is, what are the best tips for grassroots climate groups of any sort to gain more youth members? I can add a second question if that helps. I'll add a little slightly different angle. How, in keeping with the idea of mobilization, how do we get people to prioritize the climate when they vote?
Yeah, so, I guess like kind of speaking this more generally about how, we might get people more engaged in climate change, especially among, the groups such as younger adults, youth who tend to be more worried about it, but maybe don't know how to act or what to do, And so there may be this gap, right, where you're worried about it and you want to do something, but you don't know how, and you feel like you can't do something about it. And so, we know that there are certain strategies that we can use in order to kind of activate those people. And I think, speaking to the comment, we're not a grassroots organization at Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, but really you want to showcase youth. You want to listen to what they have to say. You want to give them platforms so that they can amplify their voices and so they can connect with one another and talk about these issues, and so that they can take ownership of whatever space they're trying to engage in and trying to occupy. And really showing the diversity of people in the movement is also really important, right? To have those role models and really provide resources and guidance and mentorship. And this is where older adults can come in, right? Elders, in order to show that, right, they have a responsibility to protect future generations and support younger people. And so having that, space where maybe older and younger generations can engage in discussions and work together on these initiatives, that collaboration is really important. And so, I think when it comes to prioritizing making climate change as a more, important voting issue, we know that just on average, Americans, US adults are less likely to prioritize climate change as a top voting issue compared to other issues like healthcare or the economy. And we know that it's liberal Democrats who tend to prioritize it the most. Climate change is a top voting issue to them. And so, this is something we need to recognize, is that there's many issues going on in the world. There's many things we need to address and work on. And some people have, right, that it's called this finite pool of worry. There's just a lot of things to think about. And there's only so many issues that we can be worried about and prioritize at a given time. But one really simple way to take action on climate change, aside from just talking about it with other people and voicing your concern, is to vote, right? To vote for climate policies, to vote for people who are going to take action on climate change too, and demanding action in whatever way you can, even if that's posting on social media, demanding action from institutions, corporations, and so on. Encouraging those actions is important. And we can talk about this stuff through communications as much as we can in order to really make this a public salient issue. But we can also talk about it in terms of solutions and actions that are simple behaviors people can engage in. That's my 2 cents.
I'll jump in here just with a little thing that might be helpful. It's not about voting. I don't talk about the voting, but when I'm as a journalist, I try to figure out what can make somebody interested in a climate change story. And a lot of times that means not talking about climate change. And so you can be talking about, people might not be talking about climate change or caring about climate change. I noticed that only a third of even young adults are talking about it regularly. If I saw that slide right, but maybe people are interested in biodiversity, maybe they're interested in energy independence, maybe they're interested in food systems. Because it's such an everything issue, there are so many things that matter to so many people that are connected to climate change. So that's just from the sort of the journalist, what interests a broad audience perspective.
Yeah, great. I really appreciate that, those ideas, because being from Montana, a conservative state politically, and engaging in climate work there, it's been one of the hard and interesting pieces, is trying to figure out how to communicate about climate change to an audience that politically does not align with people who generally participate in climate action. So yeah, one of the underlying kind of commonalities, like you were pointing out, Stephanie, and the other ways to engage with the concept of climate change without triggering political resistance, for me in Montana, has been appealing to people's love for things. So love for our home state is a big one. We're very proud of Montana. Appealing to love for the outdoors, for hunting and fishing, for all of these things that are impacted by climate change. And using that as a communication tool for the importance of protecting those places. even appealing to someone's love for industry and knowing that, the coal industry for many reasons is becoming less and less feasible, but that there are other industries that can have a similar culture even built around them. So anyways, one of my passion points in this work. I have a question for you, Puji, specifically. What makes you want to get involved in climate work? Where did that come from for you? What drives you now? And what makes climate work seem accessible to you instead of just simply overwhelming?
Yeah, I think what really made me interested in climate work and what sustains me now is the connection to public health. Because when I think about it, I can't really name anything more important than one's health or the community's health. I think that's something that is constantly on people's mind. And I think the literature definitely demonstrates how climate change is exacerbating pre-existing conditions. It's creating new health problems. And a lot of these negative health outcomes we are seeing in low income, predominantly Black and Brown communities. And so for me, the connection between climate change and public health and really viewing the climate crisis through a public health lens is something that is really important to me. And what really makes climate work seem accessible to me instead of overwhelming is knowing that there is a larger community. This climate movement is so, so huge. And seeing that there's other young people who also have 100 things on their plate, but are really making an impact in their community is really what drives me. And just having that support system, I think at ACE and in other climate organizations I've been a part of, knowing that you can rely on people and knowing that it's not one person by any means fighting for this. So I think that's what really helps me.
Well said. The feeling alone part in particular, or feeling not alone as a supporting factor has been big for me. I, as an introvert, tend to think I'm alone all the time, and I found such a great community in this space of people who feel similarly, think similarly, and you, because I just met you. One question for any or all of you: how do we as you said in your presentation, Puji, inoculate young people against disinformation? So I'm curious how we counter disinformation or, slightly inaccurate misinformation, or, politically motivated misinformation. What are ways to communicate around that or to spread different messages?
Yeah, I can start with that. I think one main strategy is climate education in schools, starting at a young age for students. And I know that climate education is a touchy subject in the United States, but I think it's so important to fight for widespread climate education in public schools, because I think having a deep understanding of the science behind climate change at a young age is ultimately how we equip young people with the necessary information to combat disinformation that they see online, that they hear in social groups and whatnot. I think it really starts at education at a young age.
We have also done some research on this as well, and I'll share a link in the chat with just one example. But there are several scholars out there who have looked at, ways that we can try and inoculate just people in general against the disinformation and misinformation out there about climate change. And it could come simple down to having a message that's saying people are out there who are actively trying to deceive you. There are scam artists out there. There are cons that are just essentially trying to get you to think a certain way. They may have an agenda that's biasing them to do this. And so it's trying to get people to think a little bit more critically about the information they come across on the internet. And so having a message like that, can be one way to get people to think, maybe I should start evaluating this information I come across more critically. And so I'll send a link to some research we've done. But you can also just Google it and type in inoculation climate change, and you'll get a bunch of stuff.
Awesome. Okay, I've got a few more questions I'm gonna try to squeeze in here. Rapid fire. One for you, Matthew. I think I would assume for you, is there an age at which we see awareness or interest in climate change begin to take off, or to really people start to engage?
That's a really good question. And, unfortunately, a lot of our research is restricted to adults in the US. So, we're not going to be able to look at, youth, for instance, or adolescents. So when, there starts to become more of, I guess, a click or a resonance among them in particular. But we have been noticing just this trend that it's really the youngest generations that kind of tend to have the highest levels of worry. They tend to be most concerned. Um, and so, this is something we need to continually look at because we're now just starting to get Gen Z adults into our data set, and they're the youngest generation. A lot of research previously focused on millennials. So I can't speak to that per se. But it's a really good empirical question that we definitely need to keep an eye out for an understanding of.
I'll provide some anecdotal evidence. I was around 14, I think, when I was getting involved in environmental work. But I think, it's kind of around the age when people start to consume media, is my guess, consume more media on their own, get involved in social media, I think is a big part of when people start to engage. But I have no evidence, that was just my experience. One other question, we're gonna skip to a big one that we've gotten several times in the chat here from different angles, and this is a new topic that we probably haven't discussed much in our different lines of work, and this will be the last question. How let me start with a different one. Why do you think the war in Gaza has captured the attention of youth to the degree that it has? And what can the climate movement learn from that level of widespread engagement? And kind of similarly, how do we balance engagement with other issues, with engagement with climate issues, particularly when it comes to voting? So for example, when we have Biden as a presumably pro-climate candidate, but when people are considering not voting for him as a protest against the war in Palestine, or a protest against some fossil fuel related actions of the Biden administration. Does anyone have any thoughts regarding the interplay between those?
I can just speak real quickly based on some research that we've known previously, is that really feelings of injustice and anger and that collective rage is a predictor of activism. It's a driver of getting engaged in these topics. So, just thinking about some of these issues, zooming out globally, right? These are human rights issues. Climate change is a human rights issue. And so if you think about it in that sense, you're seeing this threat to people. And that is something that can make you feel very angry. It can make you experience injustices as a result too, because certain groups are experiencing injustice as a result. They're more likely to have a threat to their human rights. So I just think in that sense, that can be a driver if you just want to think about it in that very basic emotional mechanism.
I'm gonna maybe just push back a little bit on the question. And this actually goes back to something that I got from an interview with you, Grace, last year, which is to sort of step back and ask whether activism is always the goal. And always, one of the things I thought was interesting was when you were talking about your lawsuits, you're like, this isn't necessarily activism. This is just asking people to do what they're supposed to do. And so I'm not sure that you necessarily need the activism model to make really important climate progress. It might be one important thing, but it doesn't have to be the thing.
Well said. We are coming to the end of our time here together, so thank you all for coming, and I'm going to hand this back over to Eric.
Thank you, Grace, for moderating the conversation with Puji, Stephanie, and Matthew. Thank you for sharing your research and experience. We'll send everyone who registered for this webinar a follow-up email afterwards with the recording and a bunch of the links that were mentioned by the speakers. Join us on June 12th at noon Eastern Time for our next event of our speaker series. We'll be discussing attribution science, which allows us to see what is and isn't caused by climate change and how to use that as a communications tool. Have a great rest of your week. Take care, everyone.